Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, Secretary Moniz, former Secretary Moniz, came out with a statement that he was saying that we just don't have enough battery backup. That in the long term, he says there's nowhere near enough to back up the power on the high voltage grids in the long term. Now, if building off that, the supply chain for battery development is becoming more and more dependent on foreign sources. And 60 Minutes just came out with this report on Sunday talking about, for example, rare earths and our dependency on something where China's dominated 80% of the rare earths. But yet, for battery storage, we're relying on Chile, Argentina, we're the blood diamonds of Congo to get our cobalt, and we're also in Asia. So we're becoming more and more reliant on because we don't want it in our backyard. We don't want to harvest these minerals in our backyard. How is that going to interact our ability to sustain or to develop this battery storage capability if we're depending on other nations? So, Mr. Secretary Chatterjee, could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Thank you for the question, sir. So as to, critical minerals and their availability, that's outside of the purview of the commission. I do have some familiarity with it during my time in Congress. I recall legislation being introduced in the Senate to address the very questions that you raised. I will say from our standpoint as an economic regulator, I can't speak to the supply chain and what component parts go into battery technology. Our role doesn't fit there, but what we do is, enable in our oversight of the markets to enable these technologies to be deployed in markets, and so the market demand is going to be there because of some of the facilitations that we've done through our rulemakings, but I leave it to others to speak to the dynamics of the component parts.
I hope we can get back and have more of a conversation about this, because I think it's going to be something we're going to have to address, and I'd like to understand what Congress can do to help expedite that. But let's continue on that, because I have a high regard for former Secretary Moniz when he was with DOE and now in his role speaking out. He's continuing to say, he said it first in 2013, and he said it again earlier this year, that we need to be spending more time and focus on carbon capture and nuclear energy. Now, he said that in 13. And so from 13 to 19, during that 6-year period of time, coal utilization went from 40% down to 23%. And in that same time, nuclear power they're going to be over 10% of their capacity is going to be lost. So my question in part, given that we were just talking about battery storage, if we don't have the capability of being able to have battery storage now, what's going to happen? What is the challenge to the grid for dependability, reliability, and resilience if we're losing more coal production and we're losing more nuclear and we don't have battery storage? What's the impact?
Sure. So thank you for the question. And again, you and I have had numerous conversations of this, and you're very passionate about it. I, like you, come from coal country, and I've seen firsthand the devastation that occurs in communities when the plants and the mines that feed them shut down. I similarly, because of my concern about carbon mitigation, am worried about the retirement of nuclear generation. What we are doing at the Commission is closely examining whether, in fact, some of the concerns that you raise could come to fruition, whether the premature retirement of some of these units, could they lead potentially to, depending on the deployment of other technologies and other resources, to an impact on the reliability and the resilience of the grid. Thus far, as I mentioned earlier, when Secretary Perry submitted his NOPR, our record did not support taking action in that area. We currently have a far more robust record in front of us as we examine the question of resilience. We're going to be very, very careful about it to look to see what the energy transition and its impacts are going to have. But it's any action we may or may not take has to be based on the record, has to be based on the evidence, and we will very, very thoughtfully and carefully examine that record.
In the closing seconds, I just like, maybe it's the elephant in the room. We don't have a fifth commissioner. Would having a fifth commissioner, would that expedite some of the some of the rules that have been sitting there for, we heard earlier some of the time that they haven't, no action has been taken. Would a fifth commissioner move things along?
I think the commission is always strongest when it has a full complement of 5 commissioners. That said, and I want to see 5 full commissioners here, but I point to the bipartisan agreement that my colleagues and I reached on LNG as well as on battery storage. That were 3-1 votes that had different combinations of us, and I think that's a great example of how we're continuing to get our work done despite the fact that we're in a 2-2 environment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.